Today we're talking about swords. A steel sword in the Iron Age with a gold hilt? What did the Book of Mormon's most iconic sword actually look like? And does it have more importance than we realize? This and more today on the Relics channel. The Sword of Laban. Now, to give you a brief history of what the Sword of Laban is, it starts with the Book of Mormon. Similar to the Bible, another testament of Jesus Christ, this is a record of a people and their dealings with God. The first appearance of the Sword of Laban is in the book of Nephi. Nephi, around 600 BC, Nephi is commanded to get the brass plates from Laban because this contains a record of his people. It's basically the first 5 books of Moses and some other prophecies and writings. And that is where we find the first account of the Sword of Laban. In 1 Nephi 4:9, Nephi, when talking about Laban's sword, says, "And I beheld his sword, and I drew it forth from the sheath thereof, and the hilt thereof was of pure gold, and the workmanship thereof was exceedingly fine, and I saw the blade thereof was the most precious steel." Later, Nephi takes that sword to chop off Laban's head. That sword was later used by Nephi to defend his people, and it was passed down through generations. So it was a great symbol of leadership to Nephi's people. Look at me. I'm the captain now. And eventually it's buried with the golden plates, later to be uncovered by Joseph Smith. Now, besides Nephi's description, there's actually very little descriptions we actually have about the sword. And there is also one account given by Brigham Young. It's not widely accepted and more accepted as a myth, and it's a second-hand account. Basically, Brigham Young recounting a story that Oliver Cowdery may have told. And it goes, "When they came to the place where the records were deposited, they saw that they had been placed in boxes and piled up in the corners along the walls. The first time they went there, the Sword of Laban hung upon the wall, but when they went again, it had been taken down and laid upon the table across the gold plates. It was unsheathed, and on it was written these words, 'This sword will never be sheathed again until the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of our God and his Christ.'" So does that mean etched upon the blade were those words? Or if we're to take this account as fact, that would mean the Sword of Laban has much more importance than just a sword wielded by Nephi. And the fact that Moroni chose to bury the sword with the golden plates and other relics also lends a lot of significance to the sword's importance. And then there's another account, we will go into that in the next video, of the sword possibly being linked to Joseph of Egypt or Joshua. We'll go into that in the next video. Along with that is another description of the Sword of Laban. But for now, let's look at archaeology. So first off, the steel blade. When the Book of Mormon was first published, there were no known artifacts that showed that steel blades were made that far back in 600 BC. Now, many examples have been uncovered of metallurgy of steel being known in that time, and even examples dating farther back from the time of Nephi. One of the best examples is also the closest parallel we have to the Sword of Laban, the Vered Jericho sword. Now, I highly encourage you to check out Shadiversity and this video where he goes more into depth about that and uses that as a pattern to figure out what the Sword of Laban looked like. And that's also how I patterned this sword. I'll go into a little bit more of that later. Now, the Vered Jericho sword is about 12 miles away from Jerusalem, so very close in the same region. And it's also dated to right about the same time period as Nephi, around 600 BC, and is made of steel. So just so you know, all steel is iron, but not all iron is steel. So how that works, steel is just the level of carbon in that iron. So when you have a certain amount of carbon in the iron, it is then steel. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Now, to give you a bit of history of sword making, in the Bronze Age, most weapons were made of bronze. They weren't forged. You'd melt the bronze and pour it into a mold, and that's how most of the weapons were made. Then eventually the norm became iron. That, instead of being melted because it has a much higher melting point, it was forged. That's where you hammer it into the right shape. And then eventually steel became the norm. And when it comes to steel, steel is really kind of the best material for a sword. Now back to the Vered Jericho sword, because this really is the best parallel we have to the Sword of Laban. I want to read this quote from the Israel Museum label text for the sword. This rare and exceptionally long sword, which was discovered on the floor of a building next to the skeleton of a man, dates to the end of the First Temple period. The sword is 1.05 meters long, so about 3 feet, and has a double-edged blade with a prominent central ridge running along its entire length. The hilt was originally inlaid with a material that has not survived, most probably wood. Only the nails that once secured the inlays to the hilt can still be seen. The sword's sheath was also made of wood, and all that remains of it is its bronze tip. Owing to the length and weight of the sword, it was probably necessary to hold it with 2 hands. The sword is made of iron hardened into steel, attesting to substantial metallurgic know-how. Over the years, it has become cracked due to corrosion. So a couple points here. It mentions the length of the sword. 3 feet long would have considerable heft. That's why they mention having to yield it with 2 hands. Now, Nephi, being large in stature, would be able to handle the sword probably quite well. With it that length, it would be easier to decapitate someone like Nephi did versus a shorter sword. Another notable thing is the ridge. This is something carried over from Bronze Age swords, where they'd have a ridge for reinforcement. It would make the sword more heavy. In later years, on a lot of swords, be concave to lighten the sword. Now there are some other examples of early steel work. There's some metal fragments. After some analysis, they showed carbon steel composition, making them among the earliest known steel artifacts in the world, dating back to around 1800 BC. Now, while the fragments aren't a complete sword, it does show metallurgical know-how from far before Nephi's time of being able to create steel. Now, another interesting thing, when Nephi unsheathes the sword, when he does this, it happens at nighttime. But one thing he sees right away, blade, I quote, he says, made of the most precious steel. Now, does this mean he's notating that it's steel, which is very precious in that time period because it's not a widespread form of sword making at the time? Or could this mean he's notating that this is not regular steel, this is very precious? One theory talks about how he must have been able to see very easily that this was a different form of steel. Now, one theory of that is early Damascus steel. You could easily see a special pattern in the blade. Now, could the Sword of Laban be made of this early form of Damascus, this carbonized steel that has that etched pattern, and that's why as soon as he unsheathed it, he was able to notate that it was a very precious steel? I'd suggest checking out these 2 videos. As for that kind of steel, precious steel technology, for example, by 600 BC, South India and Sri Lanka had established wood steel production, a legendary crucible steel. So this demonstrates that the technology behind steel blades with visible patterning or high quality steel existed in the broad first millennium BC timeline. So most of those examples of crucible steel are found in India, and they're usually found between 6th and 3rd century BC. But it's still an interesting theory nonetheless. One of my favorite examples, it's hard to find information on this, so it's still relatively new, but is an example of a sword dating back around that time with this crucible, early Damascus style steel. But notably, this sword has a silver hilt. So a very precious metal on the hilt, similar to the Sword of Laban, and with fine craftsmanship. So this is also a very good example and parallel with the Sword of Laban. Now, speaking of hilts, how about some examples of gold hilted swords? Well, we have many examples of that, and some examples showing very exceedingly fine craftsmanship. One of the most impressive around the time period, Chinese gold hilted sword from the Eastern Zhou dynasty, dating to 6th to 5th century BC. Now take a look at how intricately detailed this hilt is. That is very, very fine craftsmanship. Even something half as good as that would still be considered fine craftsmanship. So this shows that that level of craftsmanship for a gold hilt is totally achievable. And then here are some other examples of swords with a gold hilt. And notice how ornate these are and the craftsmanship on these. And some of these swords are found in ancient Middle East. Now, when it comes to a pure gold hilt, now gold is pretty soft, so that would not be a very good structure for the sword, but something far more likely plausible, and something we see in actual archaeological examples, is the blade being full tang and then the gold hilt being riveted on, and in some examples a small piece of bar going around to cover that up, so it has that appearance of being a pure gold hilt. And this is a much more stable structure. When it comes to weight, actually makes some sense. A large sword like this, especially if it has a reinforced ridge, would be pretty heavy to yield. So having a heavy metal back here near the hand, while that does increase the overall weight of the sword, it brings the balance back closer to the hand, making the sword easier to yield. This Sword of Laban replica that I made is based on that Vered Jericho sword. Yes, it is a fine specimen. Being about 3 feet long, having a ridge down the center, being made of steel, I've made the blade of mine look like it is thousands of years old. The gold hilt, going off of that design of being full tang, a little additional piece of gold metal running around the edge covering up that tang. And then the pommel, that design being based loosely on some of the other gold hilted swords. All that being said, do we have any other further descriptions given of the Sword of Laban? There is actually one account by Francis Gladys Bishop. And that account also factors in some other possible theories of the heritage of this sword going back farther than Laban and having a longer history. Now we'll save that for the next video. I also made another Sword of Laban to fit that description that he gives. And we'll go over that in the next video and see how that fits in and explore more of that theory. So subscribe so you don't miss that. Do you think this is what the Sword of Laban could have possibly looked like? I want to know what you think. And be sure to put in the comments, what religious relic would you like me to dissect next? Whoa.